The road ahead looked empty. That was the problem. On the morning of October 6, 1941, somewhere west of Moscow, German armored columns rolled forward through thick gray fog with the confidence of an army that believed victory was already decided. The engines of Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs growled through muddy roads cut across cold Soviet farmland. Infantry trucks bounced behind them. Officers stood half-exposed from open hatches, scanning silent tree lines while cigarette smoke drifted into the freezing
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
air. For weeks, the advance into the Soviet Union had felt unstoppable. Entire Soviet armies had collapsed. Thousands of prisoners marched east under guard. German commanders believed the Red Army was nearly broken. But that morning, the battlefield felt wrong. The villages ahead were abandoned too quickly. Farm animals wandered loose. Supply wagons sat overturned beside roads without bodies nearby. Even the artillery fire had gone quiet. You can almost feel the tension pressing against the crews inside those steel vehicles. Experienced tankers knew silence on the Eastern Front was dangerous. Usually it meant someone was waiting. Still, the German advance continued. Colonel Hermann Balk's armored units pushed deeper through the fog, while reports arrived that Soviet resistance in the sector was weak and disorganized. Luftwaffe reconnaissance had struggled because of poor visibility. Pilots returning from the front described endless clouds and low fog covering forests and open ground. But German command saw little reason for concern. They had already destroyed enormous Soviet formations during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa. Most officers believed one final drive toward Moscow would end the campaign before winter arrived. Then the 1st Panzer disappeared. At 7:40 am, radio operators lost contact with a forward reconnaissance vehicle near a wooded stretch outside the small village of Mtsensk. The transmission ended with static and one unfinished sentence. Minutes later, another vehicle reported movement inside the fog ahead. Large shapes, fast-moving. The Germans assumed they were retreating Soviet trucks. Then came the impact. A violent explosion tore through the lead Panzer III before nearby crews even saw the attacker. The shell punched through the German tank's frontal armor like thin metal. Flames burst from the turret hatch. Burning fuel sprayed across the muddy road. Shocked infantry threw themselves into ditches while commanders screamed for formation spacing. Another shell crashed into a second tank moments later, then another. But the attackers still could not be clearly seen. Inside the fog, dark shapes moved silently between the trees. German crews fired blindly into the mist. Tank guns flashed bright orange in the cold morning air. Machine guns rattled across empty fields. Some soldiers later described hearing engines circling them from multiple directions at once. Others said they only saw brief outlines before another German vehicle exploded. Then the fog shifted for just a moment, and the Germans saw them, T-34s. Wide tracks cutting through deep mud, sloped armor unlike anything most German crews had encountered before, thick turrets moving with terrifying speed, long barrels aimed directly at the advancing panzers. The Soviet tanks emerged from the fog, almost like shadows becoming solid. Not one or two vehicles, entire groups of them. The battlefield changed instantly. German anti-tank crews rushed 37 Izmir pack guns into firing positions along the roadside. The weapons had destroyed dozens of Soviet tanks earlier in the campaign. Crews fired rapidly as the T-34s advanced through smoke and fog. But something horrifying happened. The shells bounced away. One gunner later described the sound as a hammer striking iron. Round after round failed to penetrate the sloped Soviet armor. Some shots left only sparks. Others ricocheted upward into the fog. Panic spread through the German line. The T-34s kept moving. Soviet tank commander Mikhail Katukov had prepared the ambush carefully. His 4th Tank Brigade understood exactly how German armored units preferred to advance. Instead of meeting the Germans head-on in open ground, Soviet crews used forests, hidden positions, and poor visibility to strike suddenly from close range. The fog became a weapon. German tank commanders could not coordinate properly. Visibility sometimes dropped below 50 meters. Entire panzer formations lost visual contact with one another. Then the Soviet attack started hitting from the flanks. A Panzer IV, attempting to turn toward incoming fire, slid sideways in thick mud before a T-34 shell smashed through its side armor. Ammunition inside detonated instantly. Nearby infantry watched the turret lift violently into the air before crashing back down beside the burning hull. The hunter had become the hunted. For months, German armored warfare relied on speed, coordination, and aggressive movement. Blitzkrieg depended on confusion and pressure. But outside Mtsensk, Soviet crews reversed the situation completely. German vehicles advancing through narrow roads and muddy fields suddenly found themselves trapped inside kill zones they barely understood. Fog drifted through forests blackened by smoke. Burning fuel mixed with freezing air. Wounded soldiers crawled beside shattered wagons, while Soviet tanks kept appearing through the mist, firing and repositioning before German guns could track them properly. General Heinz Guderian himself soon received alarming reports from the front. Entire panzer units were struggling against new Soviet armor. Officers described enemy tanks that moved well through mud, carried powerful guns, and resisted most standard German anti-tank weapons. Some reports sounded exaggerated at first. German commanders had already encountered heavy Soviet tanks earlier in the invasion. But what made the T-34 terrifying was not only its armor. It was balance. The tank combined mobility, protection, and firepower in ways German engineers had not expected. Its wide tracks handled muddy terrain far better than many German vehicles. Its sloped armor increased survivability dramatically. And its 76 2mm gun could destroy German tanks at dangerous ranges. Worse still, Soviet crews were learning quickly. Inside one damaged Panzer III, surviving crewman Otto Carius remembered the growing fear spreading among German tankers whenever T-34s appeared unexpectedly. The Germans still possessed better optics and communication systems in many cases, but those advantages became harder to use inside forests and heavy fog. Battles turned chaotic. Close-range fighting favored whichever side reacted faster, and that morning the Soviets reacted first. By midday, German supply routes near Mtsensk were collapsing into confusion. Fuel trucks attempting to move forward became easy targets. Horse-drawn artillery teams panicked under tank fire. Infantry officers struggled to reorganize scattered units while Soviet armor attacked roads from concealed positions. One German anti-tank battery continued firing until Soviet tanks nearly reached their guns. Survivors later described shells bouncing harmlessly off advancing T-34s, while Soviet return fire destroyed gun after gun. The crews kept firing anyway, because retreating through open mud meant certain death. You can almost imagine the sound of it. Engines roaring somewhere inside white fog. Metal tracks crushing frozen earth, short bursts of machine gun fire cutting through trees, men shouting directions they could barely see. Then another explosion somewhere ahead. And always the fear that another T-34 might suddenly emerge only meters away. German commanders tried adapting quickly. 88 mm anti-aircraft guns were rushed toward the battlefield because they possessed enough power to penetrate Soviet armor. But moving those heavy weapons through muddy roads under constant attack proved difficult. Coordination broke down repeatedly. Soviet artillery also targeted crossroads and staging areas, making organized German counterattacks harder to launch. Meanwhile, the weather continued worsening. Cold rain mixed with fog across western Russia, while roads became thick rivers of mud. Vehicles bogged down constantly. German maintenance crews worked without rest, trying to repair damaged engines and frozen equipment. Soviet tanks handled the conditions better than expected, giving Red Army commanders increasing confidence. This was not the quick campaign German leadership had imagined in June 1941. Near the front lines, exhausted German infantry began hearing stories spreading from unit to unit. Stories about Soviet tanks that ignored direct hits. Stories about hidden T-34 formations appearing suddenly from forests. Stories about entire panzer crews dying before even seeing their attackers clearly. Fear changes armies slowly at first. Then, all at once, at one crossroads west of Mtsensk, German armored vehicles attempted another advance shortly before dusk. Visibility remained poor. The lead tanks moved cautiously now, unlike earlier in the morning. Every tree line looked threatening. Every fog bank felt alive. Then Soviet shells struck again. A hidden T-34 formation opened fire from elevated ground overlooking the road. German tanks tried maneuvering into firing positions, but thick mud slowed movement badly. One panzer became stuck while turning. Another collided with a supply truck during the confusion. Soviet fire kept landing accurately through the fog, while German crews struggled to identify targets. Within minutes, the attack collapsed. Surviving German vehicles reversed desperately down the road, while infantry scattered into nearby forests. Burning wrecks lit the evening fog orange and black. For the first time during the invasion, many experienced German soldiers began understanding something deeply unsettling. The Soviet Union was not collapsing, and the Red Army was adapting. The fighting near Mtsensk became one of the clearest warnings German command received during the opening phase of the Eastern Front. Soviet resistance was becoming more organized. Tank tactics were improving. Factories farther east continued producing armor faster than German planners expected possible. Even more alarming, Soviet commanders were learning how to exploit German weaknesses. The T-34 became the symbol of that change. German officers studied captured examples carefully after the battles. Engineers examined sloped armor design, suspension systems, and wide tracks. Some were shocked by how advanced certain features appeared compared to existing German tanks. General Guderian reportedly pushed strongly for improvements to German armored design after encountering the T-34 in combat. But redesigning an army during a war takes time. Time Germany no longer truly had. As October turned colder, the German drive toward Moscow slowed further. Soviet resistance hardened across multiple sectors. Reinforcements arrived from Siberia. Supply problems worsened daily. Thousands of German vehicles suffered mechanical breakdowns in freezing conditions. Men who expected victory before winter now fought endless battles through mud and snow, and always the T-34s kept appearing. Sometimes they attacked in massed formations across open ground. Sometimes they hid beside forests, waiting for German columns to pass. Sometimes they emerged through fog exactly like they had outside Mtsensk, turning confidence into terror within minutes. For German infantry, the psychological effect became enormous. Soldiers learned to recognize the sound of Soviet diesel engines before seeing the tanks themselves. Veterans later described how entire units would tense immediately whenever distant engine noise echoed through poor visibility. because they remembered what happened to the first columns that underestimated them. One German officer described watching T-34s advancing through smoke with shells striking harmlessly against their armor, while Soviet guns continued firing steadily. Another remembered seeing German crews abandon damaged vehicles after realizing standard anti-tank weapons were ineffective at certain angles. The battlefield mathematics of Blitzkrieg were changing. Earlier campaigns in Poland and France relied heavily on mobility, coordination, and shock. German armored divisions often shattered enemy defenses before opponents could respond effectively. But on the Eastern Front, distances were enormous. Soviet manpower seemed endless. And now, German forces faced a tank that could survive hits while operating effectively in terrible terrain. The foggy ambushes near Mtsensk were not isolated incidents. They represented a larger shift in the war. By November 1941, temperatures dropped sharply across the Soviet Union. German troops lacked proper winter equipment in many sectors. Engines froze overnight. Weapons malfunctioned in extreme cold. Frostbite spread through exhausted infantry formations. Meanwhile, Soviet forces launched growing counterattacks against overextended German lines. Many German soldiers who survived the battles around Mtsensk later recalled the emotional shock more than the physical destruction itself. Until then, many truly believed the Soviet Union would collapse quickly. Nazi propaganda constantly reinforced the idea that the Red Army was weak and disorganized. Early victories seemed to confirm it. Then came the T-34s through the fog. Suddenly, the enemy looked stronger, faster, more prepared than expected, and most dangerous of all, determined. The Soviet defense around Moscow gradually transformed into a brutal war of endurance Germany had never intended to fight. Every kilometer became harder to capture. Soviet factories relocated east beyond the Ural Mountains continued producing tanks, artillery, and ammunition despite enormous losses earlier in the war. German commanders began realizing that destroying Soviet armies in border battles had not ended Soviet resistance. It had hardened it. The Red Army adapted under terrible pressure. Officers learned from disasters. Tank crews gained combat experience. Soviet industry simplified production for faster output. The T-34 itself became central to that recovery because it combined effectiveness with relatively efficient manufacturing. Back near Mtsensk, the battlefield remained scarred long after the fighting moved elsewhere. Burned German vehicles rusted beside muddy roads. Frozen bodies disappeared beneath early snowfalls. Villages shattered by artillery stood silent under gray skies. But the memory of those attacks stayed alive among survivors, especially the fog. Again and again, veterans described that strange white mist hanging across roads and forests before Soviet tanks appeared. Visibility disappearing, radios failing, engines approaching from nowhere. Fear building slowly until the first explosions began. It felt less like a traditional battle and more like walking into a trap already carefully prepared. For the Soviet crews involved, the battles became proof that German armored forces could be stopped. That realization mattered enormously during the dark months of 1941. Soviet morale had suffered terribly after repeated defeats during the early invasion. Entire armies vanished, millions became prisoners, huge territories were lost. But victories against elite German panzer formations changed something psychologically. The Germans were not invincible. Colonel Mikhail Katukov's brigade earned growing recognition after the fighting near Mtsensk. Soviet commanders studied the engagement closely because it demonstrated how mobility, concealment, terrain, and surprise could overcome German tactical advantages. Instead of reckless frontal assaults, Soviet tank units increasingly used ambushes and defensive positioning. The Germans noticed. Soon, German crews became far more cautious whenever advancing into forests, villages, or poor visibility conditions. Reconnaissance became even more critical. Anti-tank support remained closer to armored columns. Infantry coordination improved where possible, but caution also slowed momentum, and momentum was the heart of Blitzkrieg. Every delay near Moscow gave the Soviet Union more time. By early December 1941, German forces approaching the Soviet capital were exhausted, frozen, and dangerously overstretched. Temperatures plunged far below zero. Men slept inside ruined buildings and damaged vehicles for warmth. Fuel shortages worsened constantly. Horses froze to death beside supply wagons. Rifles jammed from ice. Then the Soviet winter counteroffensive began. Fresh Soviet divisions attacked weakened German positions across wide sectors. T-34s once again played major roles during the fighting. German units already struggling against weather and logistics suddenly faced renewed armored assaults supported by artillery and infantry. The idea of an easy victory in the East was dead, and many historians later traced that realization back to moments exactly like the ambushes near Mtsensk, when German armored superiority first encountered a serious and terrifying challenge. Years later, surviving German veterans still described their first encounters with the T-34 almost the same way. Not with dramatic speeches or grand strategy discussions, usually with confusion. They remembered firing shells that did nothing. They remembered Soviet tanks moving through terrain German vehicles struggled to cross. And they remembered the fog. That endless cold fog where shapes appeared suddenly, fired accurately, and vanished again into smoke and trees. You can almost stand there with them for a moment. Freezing wind cutting across muddy fields, the smell of burned fuel hanging heavy in the air, engines rumbling somewhere beyond visibility, soldiers staring into white mist, waiting for shapes to emerge again, knowing they probably will. The Eastern Front eventually became the deadliest theater of the entire Second World War. Millions died across enormous battlefields stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Caucasus Mountains. Entire cities were destroyed. Armies vanished in encirclements. Winters killed almost as many men as bullets in some sectors. But during those early months of 1941, before the full scale of the war became clear, moments like the T-34 attacks near Mtsensk changed the psychology of the conflict forever, because until then, many German commanders truly believed victory was only a matter of time. Then, Soviet tanks appeared from the fog, and suddenly, the future looked very different.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.